Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's GeoTech Hour. My name is Stephanie Wander, and I'm Acting Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoTech Center. We will be centering today's conversation on conceptualizations of the internet as outlined in the book For Internets, co-authored by one of today's panelists, Dame Wendy Hall. We're looking forward to a great event featuring her and the other experts on internet governance and policy. We'd like to welcome back as our moderator, distinguished fellow David Bray, who will be introducing today's panelists and leading the event. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie. And as you said, this is going to be a great event in which we talk about the internet, where it's going, the possible fragmentation. And I'm really excited to be joined by Dame Wendy Hall as we talk about where the internet is going and what is next on the horizon. So Dame Wendy, you've obviously have an august career. You have looked at many different trends involving the internet and technology. And I was wondering if I could go to you with the first question and ask, why is this important? Why are we talking about foreign internets? Why is this an urgent issue of the now?
Well, the obvious thing to say is that, of course, during COVID, we've all realized how important the internet is if we didn't realize it before. People were talking about the fragmentation of the internet, maybe between the US and China, and what the For Internets book about that Kieran and I co-authored. And should add, of course, we've got Vint Cerf coming on, who wrote the foreword for the book and who is my hero in this whole world. We were talking about before about fragmentation, but we all piled on to the internet during COVID. The whole world did, or wherever you were, and it stayed up and running, which is a huge testament to the pioneers who designed it back in the 60s and 70s. But we know there were problems with it, and those problems are still with us today, and they're probably being exacerbated through COVID, because what we talk about in the book is that we still have, and I think the most important message from the book, which is designed to promote these types of conversations, we still have, the open internet is still there, and the technical standards that Vint and others developed are still used to run that global internet, so that wherever you are in the world, you can get onto the internet and exchange information, money, goods, whatever. But what's changing around it, and we focus in the book on the geopolitical, there are lots of perspectives you can have on the internet. And we focus, to say it very briefly, on the different cultural and geopolitical pressures rolling around the world. Starting in the US, you've got a very commercial view. That's where all the Western tech companies are. It's all about the West Coast lobbying the East Coast to get the laws they want to make money for the companies, which is fine. Keep on rolling around the world. You get to Europe, which, including UK still in Europe as a geographical entity. There it's much more about data protection and privacy. The focus in GDPR and looking at data sovereignty issues from a federal point of view the focus is hugely on that, which puts up barriers in some people's minds, whilst being very protective of the citizens. Keep rolling around the world. You get to the east towards China, and in the book we talk about the paternal internet. But we all know that from the very get-go in China, they saw the internet as something they could use to. I don't really want to use the word control, but certainly they saw its power both as a way to help citizens, but also for the government to find out what people are saying, and to kill ideas of revolution. Now, all governments use the internet to get information about people they want to catch. But if you live in China, then you know very, very much about what you can and cannot say on the internet, how it's all, the laws say the government has rights to all sorts of things. Then you've got countries like Russia, which are looking to try and bring it down in ways that will support them, and hacking in and using it for crime, and other countries like, I just want to finish, because I know you don't want me to talk for too long, but I want to make the point that, we've got I think it's almost 60% of the world is on the internet now. It's certainly over 50%, which is a fabulous achievement. Since Tim Berners-Lee invented the web, we've got 34 years ago, we've got more than 50% of the planet on the internet. And look what's happened in a country like India, how it's helped people so much to have access to bank accounts and, to be able to have an identity and so on. But there's still nearly 50% of the planet to get onto the internet, and most of those people are in rural China, rural Africa, and rural India. And China, we know what that will be. Africa, China's got a lot, is taking the internet to a lot of Africa. So in the book, we talk about India as being the swing state. 1.6 billion people. It really, in some ways, if you add India, China, and Africa, you'd have 2/3 of the internet. If it's an internet set up in China's likeness and India goes that way, then it would be a very different internet to the one we have to think of today. And the book is a different perspective on what most people think about, which is the technical layer.
Very well said and fascinating. I mean, as always, Dame Wendy, I really liked how you shared the different sort of regimes ranging from commercial approach to more of a privacy-centric approach to thinking about how, as you said, it's not exactly control, but how it can influence and shape what's done domestically within a population. And then the more shall we say, kleptocracy possible uses or other cyber means of using internets by nation states that are not necessarily on the same path as other nation states when it comes to international norms. I was wondering if you could also share a little bit of your thoughts as a rejoinder. You were one of our first guests with the GeoTech Center back in 2020 talking about data trust and what data trust means. And so I was wondering if maybe you could share your thoughts.
Oh, David, I lost you there. Can you ask that question again?
Sure, no worries. Zoom decided to hiccup at this exact moment, so we need to send a note to the internet folks. Anyway, I was going to say, you were one of our first guests that talked about data trust, and I know one of your passionate topics is thinking about how individuals as well as communities can have some equity in their data, and also there's a lot of talk about Web 3.0. What is Web 3.0 and what does it mean? So I was wondering if maybe you could share your thoughts about data trust, Web 3.0, and how it relates to these four internets that we're seeing both now and into the future.
Well, just to talk about it in a nutshell, it's really about what's happened with since the web enabled access to the internet, because it was free and open, and it's both the internet and the web work on the network effect. So the more people use it, the more people use it, and the companies grow on that network effect as well. And so we have had this, instead of having like you decide who you share your data with. Basically, the data is hoovered up by the companies, the social networks and the search engines, because they want to give up, and we use it because we want those services and we clearly want to use them. The companies want to make money out of us using them, and they run a service. So, but it's created these sort of silos of datagopolis or whatever, where we have no real control over what's happening to our data, it's very much in the control of the big companies, and to some extent some of the governments around the world as well, some of the regimes around the world, as you call them. And there's a big movement to say, well, we actually need to give the data back to the people. We need to, Tim Berners-Lee would talk about re-decentralizing the web, because the core internet is still decentralized. Okay, it's just what people do with it. And as Vint, I'm sure, will say, it's all about layers, and you have to always be clear what layer you're talking about. But Tim is very much, and his solid project, Social Link Data, is creating data pods that we can put our data in, and then we decide who we share that with. But if you're going to do that, you're going to need trusted third parties to do that, and that's where you get into data trust, because none of us, like we can't manage our finances, we need banks to do that. We would need trusted third parties, whether it's banks or lawyers or another type of organization, to be able to manage our own data in any sensible way. We'd need government to regulate for that, around that. And then you've got how are you actually going to make that change? And Web 3.0 is another, I don't like the term at all. For me, what the semantic web was that Tim talked about 20 years ago was what was Web 3.0, the idea that you could actually link data as well as documents. Because you can infer from, machines can read the data if you've got the metadata in a standard, and then infer knowledge from the linked data. That was Web 3.0 to me, but Web 3.0 has taken on this meme, which is very connected to the crypto world, to the metaverse, and to the idea that, again, we have control of our own data, and to re-decentralize the internet. But it's not clear to me where they're trying to make that change and how they're going to do it. So I don't know where that world's going, but I think we're in for some quite radical changes. And the key thing is, whose data is it, and who is responsible for managing it, and who looks after our data for us?
Very well said. Well, I liked what you were framing in that. Again, I also remember the semantic web, and when I hear Web 3.0, I'm like, wait a minute, that was already taken. But anyway, it's a historical note. And I think, like you said, there are some interesting issues ahead of us, and so I'm excited to continue the conversation with our other panelists and circle back to you as to what we can do about this as well, because we don't want to be just going on the forces of influence and change without consciously saying what choices do we want to go towards, what futures we want to go towards. And so that leads me now to Vint Cerf, obviously quite famous for playing a role in the invention of the internet and the deployment of TCP/IP. In some respects, this is your baby, Vint, and it's now, I guess is it in its awkward teenage years? I'm not sure. But I would be interested in your thoughts first. Dame Wendy alluded to, why is this important? Could you share for folks how we should think about this as layers? And then also, if you can also disambiguate for our audience the difference between the internet and the web as well.
Well, thanks so much, David, for having me on the program. And thanks, Wendy, for a really helpful introduction. First of all, it's important for everyone to recognize that the dependence on the internet, which Wendy outlined, makes us very concerned about how it evolves, how accessible it will be, and what it will do for us or do to us. So that's why this is an important topic. Second thing is that Wendy's book tries to look at how the internet has evolved into almost different species, as you see the flexibility of the architecture permitting companies or countries to adapt it to their purposes. And in some ways, I guess I'm happy to see that it is such an adaptive design, but at the same time, some of the choices are turning out to be inimical to people's interests. You mentioned layering, and I think this is an important meme to incorporate into our discussion. The internet is a layered architecture, and there are different players in the various layers. And so we have layers and players, and they are able to affect the way the internet behaves and appears to its users, depending on what layer they play in and what choices they make about how they operate that particular layer. So we find some countries changing the way the routing system works in order to inhibit flows into and out of their countries, for example. Or we find people interfering with the interpretation of domain names by inhibiting certain destinations by changing the way the domain name system responds to queries. So it's very important to recognize that there are a lot of opportunities in the various layers to interfere with, or at least alter the way in which the internet is presented to the users, or in the way in which service providers offer and can offer services. So we care a lot about that. I don't think that there's going to be any way to prevent regimes from deciding what to do within their territorial borders. And whether we like it or not, the Westphalian rules still apply, sovereignty still applies. But the term data sovereignty, which is derived from the Westphalian view, is dangerous in the following sense. Some countries are saying, well, we want to control the flow of data in and out of our countries. And the problem with this is that it will inhibit the free flow of information, which has been vital to the success of so many internet applications. And if the argument is being made, well, I need to protect the data, it has information in it about my citizens, and I don't want it to leave the country. An alternative perspective is to execute that concern at a higher layer of protocol by encrypting things. So the free flow is permitted where useful, and free flow is in fact allowed or preferred. But at the same time, you can introduce controls by encrypting things and only handing keys to the people that should have the authority to get access to the data. Some of that animates what Wendy was talking about in her final remarks, the things that Tim Berners-Lee has been trying to pursue with the solid protocols. And here the argument is that if you have encrypted information, you can decide to whom you give the key. And then that information only propagates where it's permitted. There, in the background, I worry a little bit about the fact that once the data is obtained by someone because they were authorized, what did they do with it and how did they protect it? And that's an open question. But the bottom line in the book and in this conversation is that the internet is not going to be a uniform thing. We know that now from watching it evolve and watching the various ways in which, frankly, potentially harmful behaviors have arisen in the platform. And so now I guess our job is to figure out how do we maximize benefits in this now global system while we try to minimize the harmful behaviors that are either executed by countries or by citizens who don't have your best interests at heart.
Well said, Vin. And if I could ask for two quick rejoinders, is aside from the fact that Tim Berners-Lee is associated with the web and you're associated with the internet, how would you describe to a policymaker the difference? And then I have another rejoinder after that.
Thank you for the reminder. Look, the internet is designed to be a network of computers that communicate using uniform protocols with each other. They just move data back and forth and give people access to it. Tim Berners-Lee put a layer of protocol above the TCP/IP layer, which is basically about connectivity of software. And that layer, the hypertext transport protocol and the hypertext markup language, created a standard for the presentation of information to people. And in the more recent incarnations, their ability to interact with the information that's encoded in the hypertext markup language. So this is an information layer on top of an underlying transport layer. The two are distinct, but they are bound at the hip because without the internet and the TCP/IP protocols, the hypertext transport protocol wouldn't go anywhere. And without the HTTP World Wide Web, the internet wouldn't be nearly as useful.
Well said. So if I could ask you a real quick rejoinder before we go to Teresa, is there one future or is there something with the different forms that the internet may take that you would like us to be very cautious not to go towards, if you could offer any advice as someone who has seen this from its genesis to now?
Well, I think the thing that I would strongly urge is that we look for ways to minimize the amount of fragmentation that can take place at the various layers in the architecture. And I want to emphasize that fragmentation can occur in many different places. So what we want to do is to minimize the fragmentation, maximize our ability to share information, while at the same time recognizing that we do have to put in protections for people's personal information as is expressed in GDPR, for example.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Vint. And now it's my honor to turn to Teresa Carlson. Teresa, you have obviously seen the internet through multiple phases as well. You obviously were an early proponent of cloud, both for the private and the public sector. And you saw its genesis when initially government said, we're never going to do this. And now they are doing it and they're moving with speeds. And now you're also at the vanguard of what's being done with data and data analytics. And so I'd be interested, Teresa, what do you take about the world we're in? And if we want to have some agency and choice in where we go, what would you recommend that we think about as we think about the decade ahead?
Yeah. And by the way, thanks for having me. It's, of course, an honor, Wendy. Love the book. And Ben, it's always like an honor to be with you on a panel. But this is such a great question. And we are right now, I think, at a really important time to have this discussion, because I have seen so many changes from the time I was at Microsoft, which we really didn't know what cloud was. We had the discussions, to really seeing the revolution of what cloud computing did globally to change the way governments and enterprises both thought about their business and interacted with their information. And, data is at the heart of all this. And without the internet and the web, and then the connectivity of what we've done with cloud, we've seen this explosion of information. And, even just being at Amazon when I was there and seeing how each country reacted differently, or regions were reacting differently to these changes of technology, and the ability to think about digital and transformation of that, the innovative processes they had with their data. And it has been such an unusual phenomena to see all these different groups really grapple with what they do with data. And where we are today, this idea of, where is your data? Who owns your data? Is it centralized or decentralized? And if you think about it, in the government world, which a lot of us have worked with and love that we can serve our countries around the world, governments have had different networks for a very long time. And they've done their own kind of disconnected world. We had an ability to transverse the internet and go from data center to data center. So we were trying all these different things to allow both government agencies and enterprises both secure and protect their data and think about it. But I think the idea of a decentralized web is just very much driven by an individual given the choice of where they store and process their data, but how they actually analyze it and look at it. And I think we'll always take away, making this really the 3.0 reality. But I can tell you that I see so much innovation and potential and experimentation in this space. I have to admit, there's a lot of issues that we have to deal with. But for me, I'm an innovator. I love seeing new businesses. It has been honestly an honor over the last 11 years to be able to see governments and enterprise innovate and speed the experimentation that they were never allowed to do. And I'm really anxious, honestly, to see and also participate in what this next evolution of the Web 3.0 actually brings. But I do believe there's a lot of risk here because, seeing large technology providers that I've been able to work with, and now with Splunk, your point on data and that security of that data, being in a more narrow sector and looking at it from a different lens, if you think about the intelligence agencies who want and need their information secured and air gapped and all that, but then you go to China as an example, where you're looking at these authoritarian networks, internets, where everything is modulated, right, and monitored. And I think that's hard, right? You want open information that you can share, and you want citizens to have the best possible information. But I'll just kind of add one last point here. One of my concerns is that we have a balance, I'll call a balance of both policy and innovation, because one big thing that I've seen over the last 11 years is if we're too stringent on the policy side and regulatory side, it really stagnates innovation. But I'm not advocating that you don't need it. I'm not saying that. I just think we have to get better and smarter about how we do this and ensure that policymakers understand what's happening. They have people that understand it, because around the world, when you begin to see so much regulation, there's two things that happen. One, the expense to startups and companies trying to innovate, they actually just give up because they can't survive. It's too expensive. So you need a way that these companies, because I see so much amazing technology, and then I see a lot of it just disappear because they can't stand the pressure of the funding needs. So I think we just got to make sure that we have that balance of how do we allow innovation and exploration of this, but also do it in the right way where we're not also exposing risk to countries, people, enterprises.
Well said, Teresa, and I appreciate you making a point about there needs to be a balance. It's not one or the other, and I appreciate you channeling that noted Star Wars Zen master Obi-Wan Kenobi, who says only assist deals in absolutes. So I appreciate you sharing that. So the other thing I wanted to note is obviously you were co-chair for the GeoTech Commission, and so you looked at the massive changes that are happening not just digitally but also in bio and space. And so, real quick, if possible, if you could share briefly as a rejoinder, what's one area in which you're seeing things happen by the next generation that gives you hope in an area of transformation and change?
Well, I mean, I am seeing, honestly, I've spent time, really looking at new companies. My time at Splunk, it's kind of allowed me to do some different things. One is look at different types of companies. Amazon had me run around all the world, opening countries and dealing with these issues. And at Splunk, I feel like I've been able to dive into some of these issues around data and security much more. And I do have hope, because I'll tell you why. In all of these areas, because it's become really clear to me that the most important enterprises and governments now, one, they get it. They understand that they have to rethink their architecture and design technically. And while for me, it's not moving as fast, I wanted them to go faster. 11 years of cloud for me at AWS went like that. And I was like, oh my gosh, I barely scratched the surface. But we are seeing movement. And I have to admit, COVID really changed the game. And I'll just give you one quick example. There's a company that I've been exposed to called TalkDesk, which is a digital AI call center. And we had a tool at AWS that was a call center. And people weren't thinking about call centers in a digital, hybrid way. Everybody had to go in. But all of a sudden, you've seen an explosion of nobody's going into the office, nobody's going into these call centers. And now they're starting to amass the data and information in an intelligent manner, so that allows you not just to have a call center, but to really understand the information at all levels of enterprises. So you're seeing these rapid changes of technology. On the scary side, I would say I'm still super concerned about cybersecurity. And the fact that we are everything, like I'm seeing so many more attacks, governments, the ransomware attacks on our states at every level internationally, story after story. And this is concerning. And I would just say, again, it worries me that we don't have enough skills and that our lawmakers still don't understand the real extent of the problem that we have to solve.
Well said, Teresa. And you got 2 thumbs up from Vent for referencing cybersecurity. So I'm going to go to him real quick before I go to Tricia. So Vent, can you real quick share your rejoinder?
I just wanted to say that at the core of all this is software. I mean, none of this works without software, and that's our problem. We don't know how to write software that doesn't have bugs, and we have smart people out there who figure out how to exploit them. So if anyone wants to try to deal with the problem, they're going to have to arm wrestle with the alligator called software.
So on that real quick, Vin, so I've seen some people say we should treat policy as code. If we don't even know how to write software that's not policy, I take it you're not a fan of putting policy in code as well?
Well, I think code, it's arguable that Lawrence Lessig argues that code is law. And in some sense, he's right, because it's the code that does whatever it does. Regardless of what the law says, the code does something. And we should care about that. The problem, of course, is getting it right.
Well said. All right, so that's a good segue to Tricia. You are a digital anthropologist. You have looked at different cultures around the world and how they're adapting the internet. Tricia, what do you think about what we should make of the situation we currently find ourselves in and what we should do about it?
Thanks, David. It's so exciting to be here with all the panelists and to see Vint and Wendy again after a couple of years in San Jose. We were all at the same conference. I think, regarding what Vint said, I just want to say, not only do I think we don't know how to write software, we don't know how to write socialware, which is the whole point of Wendy's book. This is not just a technical issue. So I want to make quick 3 points regarding fragmentation and what to make of it. Is that first, I think the open internet as a default and dominant ideology is that it's not just an ideology, it's also a mythology that sustains the way we operate economically. And we benefit from that, the West. And there's a lot of top-down things that are closed that we do to control, even to control this open internet that we have historically and currently. Historically, Vint knows about this more than anyone, of TCP was a top-down centralized decision from the Department of Defense. We do plenty of things to control how information flows and to analyze, to make sure that we keep our citizens safe. We do similar things as other governments, as Wendy said. So that's one point, is that just because it's open doesn't mean that we don't do, top-down closed things to it. Second is that the experience and governance has always been fragmented. It's never not been. It just didn't appear to us to be that way in the earlier days or history because it was just a more homogenous group. We didn't have the whole world on there. We didn't have different cultures and regions. So a good part of my career was has been spent in China trying to understand a whole different model of the internet, which I called information paternalism. So it was really great to see that Wendy and
we picked up on that from
yeah. So I've been publishing about that, about how this is an information paternalistic regime, as David says. And when I was working inside CENIC, I was the first and today only Western scholar that was inside CENIC, which is the equivalent of the FCC, the policymaking arm of China. And I was able to study policymakers. And I also spent time on the ground as an anthropologist, living inside internet cafes, watching the emergence of social media. And I've done this around the world. And the one thing I always come back to is saying that the way we implement internet access and policy and protocol is contextual. You can have technical decisions and say standardized, but it's always a reflection of culture. And it is a disservice to, it's almost like we are surprised by when it is, but I'm really glad that Wendy has her book out to say that this is why we have to bridge the social sciences with the study of technology at the same time, because it shouldn't be surprising anymore. It's like, of course, we're not going to just standardize openness in the protocol. And the last thing is that the consequences, I think the thing that worries me the most in the topic of the book I'm working on is that one of the consequences of a fragmented experience of the internet is that we all of a sudden have this whole catch-all privacy, catch-all solution, as we have to address privacy as the number one way to protect people. And the way this shows up is around the world is in legislation where we are putting out privacy acts. But in these acts, it actually ends up preventing the very openness and the ideals that we're trying to protect. For example, Vin, you've written a lot about the UK's online safety bill here we have the failed WPA, Washington Privacy Act, but oftentimes they're introducing policies such as stopping end-to-end encryption when that's the very thing we need to protect. And I think part of it is that fighting for privacy is a very slippery slope, because it should be table stakes to have privacy. What we need to be actually fighting for in order to combat fragmentation is our personhood. Well, privacy is our ability to control information about ourselves, which we need. I'm not saying we don't need to have that. Personhood is actually about the ability to function as a human being. And the threats we face globally across all internet regimes is our ability to exist as a human being, to shape our own decisions. And this is important because in a world where data isn't just a representation of you, it is you, right? That is a massive shift. And that to me is what we're grappling with Web3. And we're seeing that in very fragmented ways. I agree that it's not a pretty world when we're looking at what is Web3, but in the early days of Web1, it wasn't pretty also. We were all trying to figure out, running around. Well, I wasn't there at the time, but I'm assuming a lot of people were trying to figure out, what is this thing? And some people were like, it's useless. I don't know what you all are doing, you crazy physicists, I'm talking about this network of transporting information. And I think it's very similar. So this fragment, the incoherence of Web3, I'm sure existed back then. So I hope there's a little more generosity for, the newer generation of us trying to figure all this, this shift out.
I'm wondering if we should get T-shirts, Tricia, that says "Ask me about Gopher and Archie protocols." Yeah, it was like you said, it was challenging in the early days, and anyone who's done an Apache server install in the early days knows it was challenging too. So very well said. I'm going to ask you a real quick question before I go to Derry, and we've gotten some questions already started to come in. This is one of the questions that Roberto has asked, which is, have you seen any good approaches that balance environments that actually incubate the best balance between innovation and protecting people in your travels, Tricia? Have you seen that work anywhere, or is there any place you'd say they seem to be a good model for others to consider?
I've been I moved to Peru to build out part of the internet access to ensure that the other third of the country that was living in the jungles and living in the mountains would have access. And I don't think there's any perfect model, but you'll see that in countries like Peru, where the government, South America, where governments are weaker, and you have corporations that are stronger, those corporations they're saying, well, we need to fill the void. We actually need to look out for our country. And so while other outsiders can be like, how dare a corporation, maybe Europe might be like, oh, that is so bad, a corporation is dictating the future of the internet and policies, but it's like, this is the context. And so I don't think there's any best practice, is that every region is contextual. We're working in complex systems, and there's not going to be any one thing that's going to be great for all places. And so I think that's what I want to say there, is there's no one best practice. I think everyone is trying to make do with their own history and like thousands of years of culture.
Context, context, context. Very well said. So Derry, you have a high bar to follow, having followed Dame Wendy, Vint, Teresa, and Trisha. I don't envy you, but I know you can bring it. And you obviously have done a lot, both with digital technologies, and you also are leading in terms of the actual like real world pragmatic adoption of AI in government. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about, what do we make of this circumstance? What do we see that's going on? And what do we take away in terms of how we want to shape the future? Derry, over to you. Oh, and you need to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Yep. So I think this is, first of all, you're right. It's a hard set of act to follow, but I'm going to try my best here. I think with regard to what everyone has been saying, and based on Wendy from your book's perspective, we have the different segmentations of the internet, not because someone intentionally went out and said, we're carving this out this way. I think what we're finding out is that these different pods and the way how groupings start to occurs not just because a government says so. We have those happening because culture says so sometimes. And culture, the bounds of the internet has removed the barriers to the culture to be, your 5 neighbors around you, or the folks within your town. Your culture actually becomes a pod of folks that you're forming across the globe. For you have gamers who have been doing this for years. You've got folks on Facebook doing various groups, and other social media, Twitter. I mean, you name it, you'll find groupings of folks. So what you have is these different cultures kind of coming together, clashing with the government regimes that kind of go along with that, for that openness. Right. And with that openness, then comes the challenge of how does one innovate in between. And I think that therein lies these challenges of how do you innovate with these culture clashes that take place along the way? Because, and I say culture clashes because what may work for an openness of sharing of data, let's say within the United States, absolutely will not work within the Europe with regard to the laws that are passed for privacy. Right? You cannot just leverage all this data, even though you're trying to do something really well intentioned. For example, I would like to start capturing good data about people and trends, so that way I can make a better, let's say, a better causeway, for folks, and that's a good thing, right? Being able to map out where programs should be implemented, better bus routes, for example. And then you start to run into challenges. How do I get access to the data? Where do I get it? And how do I push that forward? And I think this is where, Trisha, you said it, we can't look down on corporations, despite our collective bashing of corporations. Corporations are what actually help drive these conversations to move it forward. They're the ones taking the risk and saying, let's try something new. Let's innovate and bring something new to the table to see how we break down these barriers, or how do we work within the constraints of these barriers and still be able to push that new innovation to the table. I still think we're going to have that segmentation. The question is, can we bring that segmentation together through the use of the corporations combined with the policymakers to come to some sort of balance? And I think the key word here is balance, not something that we're going to achieve without just, without some sort of policy infused into it, but too much will then stifle that innovation. So we've got to figure out how we bring those two parties together to make that happen. And I think as we continue to move forward in this new space of, all the new technologies, more interconnected folks and interconnected groups, how do we bridge the gap between the groups to actually continue to push forward that innovation? Across the board, even within those government spaces that from the book. So
well said, Derry. And I also know you have been doing a lot of work. You talked about different cultures, but you've also done some work in which you've seen things that have happened on the blockchain involving crypto that may not necessarily be for the best of all humanity. So I wonder if that has made you cynical, or if it's made you more seasoned or informed as you look at what's happening with this world of crypto, blockchain, et cetera. What has been your experience in terms of what you've empirically seen that's happening on the web?
I would like to say I'm optimistic. However, the cynical nature of seeing the trends, seeing what's happened, see what's going on over the past several years is and this is not a naysayer for blockchain technology. It has its use cases, it has its needs across the board. I think you have the challenges of the ability to have the freedom of finance moving across spaces, allowing people to move money is fantastic. And I think those are great things. I think the challenge here that we're seeing here and that I've been seeing is we have groups of actors who are actually controlling smaller groups of actors that are pushing and leveraging these nuanced technologies to actually push an agenda that have a broad reaching negative consequences. They leverage it from pushing information that is good, bad, or indifferent, right? I'll leave it to the individuals to judge what they deem any particular piece of information as good or bad, because what may be good and bad for you and me may not be good, may not be seen the same way across other cultures. This kind of goes back to that cultural thing. So what I've seen with the cryptocurrencies, unfortunately, has still continued to be the proliferation of the negative challenges and negative use cases. And despite all of the wonderful hype with NFTs, there are still NFT thefts. There are still folks creating these things as the startups. And this happens as time goes on because there's no policies here. And how does one put a policy in when it's so new? It hasn't caught up to this. So a organization decides, I'm going to mint brand new NFTs and we're going to drop that tomorrow. And they steal everyone's money and then suddenly just disappears and no one has any recourse. I think that's the challenge that we're seeing is how do we marry up those two problems? And I don't see a speed at which the policy can keep up with that innovation in being able to prevent that. So I think it kind of goes back. Someone mentioned the word education. I can't remember who it was earlier, but I think we have a cybersecurity and a cyber education that is required. And we should not be so easy to shy away from the world is ending, I'm going to put my tinfoil hat on conversation to at least scare someone to recognize maybe I should think before I click that button.
Well said. And it sounds like you're speaking as someone who's been both played the role of a CIO and a CISO before when you're recommending, think before you click. So
a few times, yes.
Very well said, Derry. So now I'd like to go to the hows and moving forward. First, Dame Wendy, there's been some conversations about what does this all mean and what does it mean for the changing world. I'm particularly interested if you were approached by the United Nations Secretary General, asked for your recommendation about how can we consider the internet's future and what role should the UN play, if anything, beyond some of the committees that it has. What would be your advice to the Secretary General?
Well, that's a hard one because it's hard. It's not clear the United Nations is the right place to play this out. I think that for me, the most important thing is this understanding of layers, as Vint has always talked about, and we talk about in the book, is that none of us are we talking about throwing away the basic infrastructure, and I take Trisha's point about, and I loved your point, Trisha, about web, give us a chance. Let's try Web 3.0 because you old fuddy-duddies, you're stuck in your ways. And I absolutely accept that. And we are heading for major changes going forward. And it's, I'm looking at down the line at the metaverse and thinking, if we can't get it right in the 2D internet, as I call it, when you get into a 3D or even 4D internet, we are lost in terms of things like how do you prove who you are, right? And do we need global regulation about proving who you are digitally? Now that whether you can't create, the UN's not going to be able to create a law around that because it's going to be different in every country or every regime, whatever you want to call it. But we need to have some protection for people in terms of knowing who trusting. It all comes back to the word trust. Who are you talking to? What are they going to do with my data? Who's protecting my data for me? Is it my government? Is it a trusted third party? No one's mentioned health. Usually by this point, people have got into health data because that's the one that is the obvious one to talk about. We want I want to share my health data because I want better drugs, I want more cures for things, and I want people to be able to use the data collectively, to use AI to help us make great breakthroughs in health, as an example. Could be energy, all sorts of things, net zero, all that. And so, and in the UK, we have this idea that we love, we have this, our health service, and it's all our data goes in the health service. And we can't agree yet in the UK about whose data is it, right? People are saying, you can't, I'm not going to give my data. I'm not going to let anyone access my data because I don't trust the government. I don't trust the people running the NHS, who are they going to sell it to? Now, and there is a way to make this whole issue about data assets and companies can, there are assets. So there's a whole world out there on that. I think so. Coming back to the UN, I think it's about protecting the core infrastructure. It's a bit like talking about if you're talking about trains, and I don't know if this will work for Vint, but talking about trains, and you're not going to rip up the railways, the rail tracks, right? What you're going to do is innovate what runs on those rail tracks and how you manage it using software. That's what and I think the most important thing is to get across to the global leaders that people trying to is that basic infrastructure needs to be protected. We can experiment around that and the other layers, and we have to accept that it will be. We have to accept there are cultural differences. People will want different views on how personal data is managed, how you protect, to what layer you protect. And Vince spoke very well about data sovereignty. I totally agree with what he said about data sovereignty and encryption and which layer you try and protect people. And we can have different experiments maybe on in whose hands you entrust your personal data. But the core infrastructure we need to protect. Otherwise, in the next pandemic, we won't be able to talk to each other.
Well said. Well said, Dame Wendy. And I really liked your analogy of, protect the infrastructure, innovate what runs on it. So panelists, we're about 13 minutes before we'll have to unfortunately conclude this very fruitful dialogue, but I would like to first go to Teresa because we did have a question from Roberto asking, so could you real quick give some very short thoughts about what does the future of the internet and data storage and data processing mean in space, on the moon, and beyond?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I'm actually seeing an explosion of this. If you look at all the changes in business and space, now you have 3 international space stations going up from US providers. You have Axiom, Lockheed Martin, you have Blue Origin now that have all announced, some on their own dime. You have these swarm satellites that have come up like Kuiper and Starlink that are these they're LEO satellites in low Earth orbit. That's going to provide affordable broadband, which we all love. And if you go to, many places around the world, Africa and others, it's just not there. I think 49% of our world that's not connected today. But I would say it also provides a lot of vulnerabilities too, a lot more cyber vulnerabilities that we have to be super cautious of. And we have to make sure that we understand it, we secure it well, because as you see, there's satellites being shot down every day. It's like drones. We have to worry about all these things. And because we spend billions of dollars to put them up, doesn't mean they're going to stay there. So I think there's a lot of innovation or invention that still has to happen here and experimentation before we really get it right. And I know one of the things I really worked on, I was a big proponent of this, and I'm a big believer in it because I do think that think about tide in space, we have acting in space, we have tons of experimentation going on for research today that a lot of people don't even realize. The whole point of some of these groups like Axiom and others, you see SpaceX, they're taking it private citizens, Blue Origin, they're trying to get the average citizen. Well, I say average, most of them are billionaires or being taken out, but the average individual, they're trying to get access and demonstrate that there's possibilities there, that what can be done. So we're in such early days of it. And I'll just say one of the things that we worked on when I was at Amazon, I was super passionate about it. I started our aerospace and satellite business unit there. And we were working closely with the Amazon team on Kuiper And I will just say, we created new models like ground station for data processing, the movement, because if you think about satellites today, you have a lot of time before you can actually hit those satellites. And we were trying to create new models so you have continuous access to those satellites. And then that data processing can go up and down. And we used to laugh and say, everybody's going to want their Hulu in space, or Netflix, or Amazon, to be able to see that. So I think there's vulnerabilities, but opportunities. And you hear my dog. I'm sorry. This is
no worries. That's all good. Such is the nature of pandemic. It's great to know. I think actually that leads to a good segue. First, thank you for those great thoughts, Teresa, on the future of space. But it's also a good segue, real quick, Vint, because probably about a minute or so before we go to the lightning round. One, if you could share a little bit about the Internet Society's intent, and then two, if I understand correctly, you are working on an internet for other species, including other animals. And so given that Teresa's dog has decided to say that they want internet as well, if you could real quick give a short 30 seconds on that after you talk about the Internet Society's intent.
Sure. First of all, when the Internet Society was named, we all imagined back in 1992 that a kind of society would emerge from the Internet. And I think what's happened is that a multicultural society has emerged, and it's a complicated one. With regard to the Interspecies Internet, if people are interested, interspecies.io is looking at how we could use the Internet to help non-human species interact with each other. And if I could just add one third point with regard to Internet and space, the Interplanetary Network Special Interest Group of the Internet Society is pursuing an interplanetary Internet implementation. And one of the things arising was the architecture and governance of such a thing. It turns out there is a worked example in the Artemis Accords that have been set up for the Artemis and Gateway missions, signed by multiple countries, representatives of multiple countries. And I would urge the listeners to search for Artemis Accords and read them, because that's relevant to doing commercial activity in space.
Extremely well said, both on the interspecies internet as well as the interplanetary internet, and that points to the possible future ahead as we scale out, as Dame Wendy said, the tracks beyond what we already have on the ground. As a father of a 4-year-old who's fascinated with otters, apparently otters hold hands when they fall asleep and float down the river. So we need to recognize we are not the only life form on this planet. So now, panelists, we are going to transition to lightning round. We have about 7.5 minutes. This is where you get to share 1 or 2 big takeaways you think we should advise to policymakers, leaders in the private sectors, the public, about what we need to do going forward from this. I'd like to go first to Derry, then Tricia, then Teresa, then Vint, and then close with Dame Wendy. So Derry, you now get to be in a hot seat at the beginning in terms of what are your recommendations, 1 or 2 big recommendations for how we move forward from this.
So I think as we continue to look at innovation, not to stop at because it says that nothing's been done in X, Y, and Z space, we should stop doing it or not do it. We should always try, because the failure of that you achieve along the way is actually going to lead to some true innovations. And we should continue to do that. And I think what corporations need to do is be a bit more open with how they're leveraging that information and publishing that information. So that way, when policymakers hear about it, they don't suddenly ask the wrong questions and we all look a little bit more crazier. So I think let's continue to move forward with the innovations, but corporations need to be good netizens as well, and actually start talking more about why they're doing it and what their intentions are, and publishing some more information behind it.
Well said, and I liked both of you said, talking about intentionality, being open to having those conversations. And as you said, failure is a learning opportunity. In fact, it's an acronym, first attempt at iterative learning. So very wise words, Derry. Tricia, over to you in terms of your recommendations, both 1 or 2 recommendations for policymakers, private sector, and also if you could real quick touch upon also, what does right to forget mean in a world that is increasingly becoming fragmented on the internet too?
Let me start with that last one, the right to forget. What the right to forget is really a right to representation. So this is my ask for policymakers and everyone, is to stop framing everything as a right to privacy, because that is so vague, it is so abstract, it's such a slippery slope. And I'm really exhausted of trying to talk to policymakers to explain, and technologists to explain, that privacy can mean so many things. It's just absolutely empty now. We're talking over each other. Let's actually get very specific with our language so we can get specific with our changes, which is what we're talking about is a right to representation. And that is is now important because you can act upon a person by acting upon their data. That was not the case before, but with increasingly more people on the internet and more of our personal data out there, it's changed now. Before, if you made a painting of yourself, which is a representation of you, you didn't act upon yourself through the painting. No entity could, right? But now we're at the point where that representation is you. So let's stop talking about the data as personal data and then it's you. It's like that's all one and the same. So I want to start creating legislation, creating really smart conversations on what does the right to representation mean. And my other ask to policymakers and to everyone is the key question I think we should be answering is how do we build systems that are optimizing equity at all layers, technical and social layers. And so it's not just saying how can we make tech companies and governments, especially tech companies, more equal or equitable, because you can have 50% women at your company or university program and have representation ethnically, racially, class-wise, and you can still be doing terrible things. Right. So that's not enough. Equity as D&I is table stakes. So do that and ask the question is how is tech a driver of equity in society? And those are two very distinct questions. And I think that's why, I love all the panelists and their work, especially all the decades of work that Wendy and Vin have been doing, because they're not just saying how do we make companies more equitable? They're saying actually how do we make sure that internet is a driver of equity? And so I want to make sure we're also getting clarity on that discussion.
Well said, Tricia. I feel like I should do like a multiple plus 100 for what you just said. So very well said. Teresa, I'm open to your thoughts as to what you think we should do as takeaways for policymakers, leaders in the private sector, and the public as a whole, based on what we've just talked about today.
Well, the U.S. Treasury, I think, was founded in 1789, and it's served us well for over hundreds of years, but even institutions like that have to innovate. And I think one takeaway is that our technological and financial leadership depends on our ability to develop these world-class systems that support better payments, more innovative digital identity management, data protection, and much broader, I think, access to opportunity. Just like what we were just talking about, I think it's important everybody has access, and that is the one thing that the internet has provided. And I was always happy to say that I felt cloud was also a great equalizer because it gave everybody quick access and opportunity to go build things. And I think these systems, they're going to emerge from these public-private collaborations and sensible regulation and standards that need to ensue that are really tailored at different levels. And look at the risk inherently, but also, like I said earlier, provide that flexibility for innovation for new companies and technologies. I love what Vince said earlier. I wanted to make a comment about software is so like training, education, and tools of individuals, but that we do need to get companies to think about more using AI and machine learning within their software development for self-healing, so that everything is not always based on humans, but we're teaching and training humans to take advantage of that higher evolution that software can actually bring to the table, which I'm a big believer, especially when we see all the issues with cyber. And my one last point, I'd just like to say, I don't think that we can put all this on the private sector alone. We have done some of this in the past. And I think our future depends really heavily on new ways of thinking together in the private sector and public sector together at all levels. And I would just really ask the lawmakers to spend time and make sure their staff has really educated and talented individuals who understand technology, software, all the things that we've been talking about today. It's hard to make laws if you don't understand what's happening.
Extremely well said, Teresa. And I really liked your closing point about we need to figure out new ways of working, that we don't put this on the backs of any one sector. And like you said, we need to understand and be informed. Otherwise, we may lead ourselves into places we don't want to go. As you know, I mean, I'm passionate about trying to figure out new ways of working together and have both the battle scars and more from those experiences.
Yes, you've done a great job. We need you to keep doing what you're doing too.
Well, I get my energy from all of you here. So it is my honor to be doing what I can with all of you. Vint, open to your thoughts as to recommendations you would have, one or two recommendations for different audiences and different stakeholders.
Given we're almost out of time, let me associate my remarks with Tricia's comments, which I strongly agree with, and also with the point about policymakers having access to good metaphors so that they understand the layers and players of the internet. before they start making policy. So the last point I would make is that we are also looking for agency for the users of the internet. And I include in the users companies and institutions as well as individuals. And I'll stop there.
Extremely well said. A lot that we could easily do a whole nother hour on that, but I really appreciate your point about agency, and that is something we need to be thinking about. Dame Wendy, can you bring it home for us in your closing remarks?
Well, we just scratched the surface here. I feel like we want to go for another hour, and I'll just reflect a bit on what others have said. But picking up on everybody, to stress the point that the internet is a socio-technical ecosystem. It is not just technical, and I think that any discussion about futures, about, it isn't just about government. We shouldn't just look to government to regulate. And you were talking about, I think, the UK's internet safety bill that's about to be published, which puts a lot of onus on the companies. And it isn't just about the companies. It's and as Tricia said, we want representation, yes, but we have a duty too. We have a moral responsibility to behave well on the internet. And we shouldn't duck that. We shouldn't do things on the internet that we wouldn't do in the real world. And I think this is an education point. And, you can't regulate for that. But, we put locks on our doors and locks on our windows to stop the thieves coming in. And that's just it's an obvious thing. There isn't a law that says you have to have a lock on your door, but you won't get your insurance money if you get broken into. These things have evolved over centuries, millennia almost. This internet thing is evolving in our own lifetimes. And I do think that the world has said, right, well, I don't understand the internet, and so I'm just going to follow the crowd. And I really think we need to get a sense of moral responsibility, because it is actually our internet. It isn't owned by anyone else. It is ours. And it is our responsibility to look after it as much as it's the digital world, as much as it's our responsibility to look after the physical world. And I'm just going to leave it there.
Well, thank you, Dame Wendy. Those were extremely poignant words. I was reminded of the People-Centered Internet event we did in December of 2018, where you spoke, and that was about our digital future and emphasizing that it's our digital future together. So I want to thank all of you. I want to thank Teresa, Tricia, Derry, and Dame Wendy, most in particular, for your wonderful book and actually bringing together this wonderful conversation. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this dialogue. And we'll close, as we like to say at the GeoTech Center, please be bold, please be brave, and most importantly, please be benevolent for the future ahead. We'll see you next time.